Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Eyal Press. Eyal is a writer and a journalist. He contributes to the New York Times, the New Yorker, and other publications. He's also a sociologist with a PhD from York University. His previous books are Absolute Convictions and Beautiful Souls. And today we will speak about his latest book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. Eyo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on.
So this is a book that comes right on time when many people are considered essential workers, but of course you have a different perspective and you will tell us more about your definitions and your point of view. But before that, I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your background. You have been writing for these nice publications and you have been writing books. So can you just give us a little bit of the origin story?
Sure. You did a great job in your introduction, but I'll just fill in a little more. I've spent most of my career writing for magazines in the United States, doing what's called long form nonfiction. So in-depth articles that aren't just sort of, the typical newspaper summary of what happened, but more analytical and more character driven with stories and a little more in-depth treatment. I, as you said, have written 3 books. My background, I was a history major in college, and I still am sort of a history nerd. I love to read history, and if in another life I might have been a historian. But I also, as you mentioned, recently completed a PhD in sociology, and that was a really interesting way to really deepen my both my knowledge base, and I hope that's reflected in Dirty Work in this book, which is heavily influenced by a couple of social scientists, but also I think is a way to think in new ways about how to what counts as truth, and how do you I think for journalists, the most important thing is the story. And for sociologists, the most important thing is whether the story is representative. And so I think combining those two things is really critical.
And how is it that you choose long form as, let's say, opposed short form? Is it that short form is too restrictive and you didn't get to develop your ideas enough?
Yeah, I think that I was just never very interested in reporting for the sake of reporting. In other words, being a correspondent and just getting the latest news to the world. Some people live for that and love the scoop and the latest changing headlines. I don't live for that. I live for what's behind the headlines, for what is explanatory journalism, or analytical and narrative driven, that takes you inside a world to make you think about politics, ideas, you know, uh, good and bad, morality and ethics.
Amazing. Okay, can you give us a word or two about your previous work, Absolute Convictions and Beautiful Souls?
Sure. Absolute Convictions, my first book, was actually quite a personal book. It's about the city I grew up in, Buffalo, New York, and the abortion wars that unfolded there over several decades, that engulfed not just the city in protests and demonstrations and arrests and controversy, but also the medical practice of my father, an OBGYN and an abortion provider, who was unexpectedly found himself on the front lines of this conflict. So that was Absolute Convictions. Um, Second book was called Beautiful Souls, and it is about 4 people, real stories of people who, when asked to conform or go along with unjust orders, decided to defy those orders, to refuse to go along. So it's about moral courage and acts of conscience in the face of, sometimes in the face of risking one's life, sometimes in the face of risking one's job. Both of those books in different ways are, if there's a similar theme, it's it's how individuals navigate morally difficult situations. Both my father and others in Absolute Convictions, and the characters in Beautiful Souls. And that is also very much one of the themes in Dirty Work, my new book.
Okay, so in Dirty Work, how do you stumble upon this subject?
So, as I said, I had written a book about people who display moral courage, and in a sense, they keep their hands clean, right? They're told, they come to these moments of, um, should you go along or should you do what you think is right? And somehow these four individuals I wrote about found the courage to not go along. That's very difficult to do. There's a lot of social science and social psychology in that book that discusses how powerful the compulsion is to go along in those situations. I was fascinated by that for both moral and psychological reasons. But as I wrote that book, I also started thinking more and more about the people who do go along in those situations, who are not able to keep their hands clean. And so there's a seed in that book of, shifting the focus to, in a way, the more typical story, which is the insider who ends up going along and doing something that goes against their their um, their principles in some way. And if Beautiful Souls is about the costs of resisting, Dirty Work is about the costs of conforming, of going along.
So at the beginning of the book, you have a section where you describe the origin from your point of view of the word dirty work. Can you tell us about that origin?
Yes. So dirty work is a very common expression. And when you hear it on the street, I think most people think of just an unpleasant job, maybe something like collecting the garbage. Um, but that's not my definition. That's not what I use. I go back to a sociologist named Everett Hughes and a paper that he published in 1962 called Good People and Dirty Work. And in that essay, Hughes really describes dirty work as a social activity that is morally suspect or unethical, but that society depends on and tacitly condones, and just doesn't want to hear too much about. That's kind of the nature of dirty work in that essay that Hughes describes. The example that led him to this concept uh, was the case of Nazi Germany. And this is going to sound, I have to explain it a little, because when people first hear it, they think, what does that have to do with us, right? With the world we live in today. Hughes was an American sociologist, and he went to post-war Germany after World War II. And he talked to what he called the good people. These were intellectuals and cosmopolitan citizens who told him the Nazis, that was a terrible thing, and it had nothing to do with us. We weren't approving of that. In fact, they were ashamed when he brought up everything that had happened under the Nazis. But at the same time, they went on to talk about how the Jews in Germany were a problem, as they put it, a problem, and something had to be done about this problem. Hughes keeps hearing this. On the one hand, I'm ashamed of what the Nazis did. On the other hand, well, the Jews, they were kind of filthy and they were a problem and they took all the good jobs. And he decides that there's something interesting here going on, and it's that the good people he's meeting uh, are actually they it's not that they approve of the dirty work that the Nazis did, but they don't want to hear too much about it. They don't ask enough questions about it because at some unconscious level, they feel this problem has to be taken care of. And Hughes goes on to say in that essay that this dynamic exists in every society, that in every society you have categories of dirty work that the good people in society know about, but kind of want to ignore and keep in the shadows. And it's that idea that I've revived and taken to this book.
So your book in the title is Inequality in America, but isn't this something that practically in every society goes on? I mean, I can't even think of the most envious society, let's say the Nordic country, which everyone uses as example of prosperity and equality. And I'm sure there's someone picking up the garbage and slaughtering animals and doing this the same thing that people are doing in America.
Yeah, I think that there's a, I don't clarify, I don't say it explicitly, but I think you're correct that I do allude to the question in the very beginning of the book that one could say that there certain amount of dirty work is inevitable in any society. I probably agree with that. I, you know, you don't have clean without dirty. You don't have good without bad. These things are in a kind of dialectical relationship, at least in my mind. And human nature being what it is, uh, you know, you, I think you would look in vain for a society in history where you wouldn't be able to find examples of what I call dirty work going on. At the same time, I think how much of it goes on and the conditions it goes on under, that can vary a
Mm.
lot, and who it gets assigned to, right? So if you think of India in the previous eras, and you think of the caste of untouchables who were given, in a caste society, who were given the most disreputable jobs. And these jobs, things like handling leather, which in that society was seen as completely dirty, uh, turned you into a pariah, turned you into a social outcast, right? Well, that's not inevitable. That system was particular to a certain society, a society that is arranged unequally and hierarchically, that delegates this work to certain castes. Now, in the United States, there are no formal castes, and the United States loves to think of itself as a classless society. But it is very much my argument in this book that America is not a classless society by any means. This is a myth. And the dirty work in America is disproportionately assigned to the people at the lowest levels of society. So it's not quite that you're, an untouchable here, but you're a poor person on the margins. You're an undocumented immigrant. You're a woman. You're a person of color. You're from a town that has fewer jobs and opportunities. That's where we see the dirty work in America. And I think that bringing that in, this is a book about work, but it's also about social class and power.
Uh, okay. Okay. So, yes, I was married for a while to a woman who is a vegan, and she tried to force her family to see these horrendous videos of animal cruelty. And of course, her family, who all like enjoy eating hamburgers and fried chicken, they all refused to see these videos, and even they ostracized her for a while. They didn't invite her for any more barbecues for a
Yes.
couple of months. So isn't that a little bit of a reflection of society in general? People know that this kind of job exists, and they just refuse to see it. I mean, and never mind do anything about it. Someone has to do that work, and I'm paying money for this hamburger, and it is to societies to to I don't know, distribute this kind of jobs.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and it's an interesting story to think about that obviously impacted you personally. But I think that the impulse that human beings feel to not see the dirty work going on around them, I think that's also very human. And so I wouldn't say of the people in your family who didn't want to watch those videos that there's anything strange about them. In fact, they're very normal in a certain way. Um, but I also think that your ex-wife was correct to say, if you're going to eat meat, you should see the conditions under which it is processed and produced, because it may be acceptable to you that animals will be raised for slaughter. That may be a decision as a society. I think that in the United States, most people would reach the conclusion that we're okay with that. We see that there's cruelty to the animals, but we also want our hamburgers and our steaks, and so we're willing to have the bargain. But are you willing to have not just animals raised for slaughter, but animals raised under the incredibly inhumane and brutal conditions that prevail in the American food system? That's a very different question, because that gets into, how come so many consumers go to the supermarket and they want to see humanely raised on the package, or they want to see organic on the package, or they want something to assure them? That's because there's enough out there already in this culture for people to know through books like Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma, or Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals. Those are both books I write about in this book and discuss. And these were, very popular books that kind of show it's not just that animals are raised for slaughter, it's that they're raised and killed in conditions of extreme brutality. Are we okay with that? That I'm not so sure. I think that a lot of the reason we're okay with it is because we don't see it. And I think that throughout the book, I'm kind of toying with that idea. How much of this is, acceptable to people, and how much of it is deliberately hidden because it really is actually unacceptable to us.
Okay, another question. So you mentioned a minute ago about the caste system in India, and this is a system in which people were born and die in the same system. But we tend to think of North America as a place where people, if they want to, they can change the place where they are or the profession that they do for something else. And I give you an example. I am an immigrant. I came here. My first job was as a janitor, which in other words, I was cleaning toilets for 2 years,
Yeah.
and
Dirty work.
yeah, and didn't see that as the thing that I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and I looked for other opportunities. And I have no white privilege, although my skin tone is light, but I still struggle to speak English, French, even worse. Nevertheless, I managed to move on. So in this situation where there's dirty work, but in a society where people, if they want to, I don't know how much flexibility there is, but there must be some flexibility to get out of the warehouse, to get out of, I don't know, whatever bad situations they are in.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And I actually say in the book, there's a section of the book where I talk about Primo Levi, a writer of enormous power and was influenced me greatly. And Primo Levi wrote a very famous essay called The Gray Zone. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but The Gray Zone is an essay about being in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, which Levi was, and realizing that um, a lot of the work in the camp, separating people into groups, sweeping and all of these mundane tasks were assigned to prisoners, to other prisoners. The Germans and Primo Levi called this Nazi Germany's most demonic crime, that they not only engaged in genocide, but they put the victims into roles of power to run this demonic system. It's hard to imagine anything more harrowing and cruel. But the reason I bring it all up is that in this essay, Levi talks about gray, ambiguous persons. These were the category of prisoners that went along and became, did these tasks because they thought it would help them survive somehow. Maybe the Nazis will spare me if I do this. Now, the truth of the matter is they were not spared. And the other truth of the matter, crucially, is that in that environment, they had no choice, right? It was, you had a choice, but not about survival. This was kill or be killed. This was, Levi says in that essay that even though he reflects critically on these prisoners who did this, very understandably, he was a victim, he was a survivor. He also says, this was an environment in which the room for moral choice was zero. There was zero room for moral choice. And I think that's probably true in an environment like that. And it is not true in most societies. It's different in any society you can think of, even an authoritarian country, let alone a democracy like the United States or Canada, where you live. And so I discuss this essay, and then I sort of pull back and say, yes, there are far more choices. There's far more space for moral choice in a society like the United States. It's in some sense, we're talking about apples and oranges in that sense. On the other hand, in that essay, Levi talks about how power is something that exists in every social environment. We have to look at how power shapes and constrains the choices that people make, right? And I think that's the other sort of universal lesson in that essay. And, the fact of the matter is that class, race, social stratification, all of these things, very much educational level, geographic location, these things shape the choices people have, even in a so-called free society. And in some sense, when there is room for moral choice, then it gets all the more interesting. What should a person do? Should they go along, or should they quit their job? The job is causing them to feel they're, in some sense, dirty, they're stigmatized, or they're whatever it is, but they could quit and do something else. So what should you do? But if you quit, you might not have a paycheck next week, and you rely on that to survive for the. So those are some of the dilemmas that I write about in this book.
Right. Well, your book gives us a lot to think about, in particular about inequality and the social structures in North America, because this applies to Canada as well. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work.
Sure. I'm gonna not just tell listeners the title, but I'll show them. I'll show them the book. This is it. It's called Dirty Work, Essential Jobs, and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. If you have a local community bookstore, that would be the place I would urge people to order and buy the book first, because I love community bookstores and they're struggling right now during the pandemic. You, of course, can find the book on Amazon or other ways to order it online. Um, and it's also available as an audio book for people who
Wow.
prefer to listen to a book.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been so illuminating.
Thank you very much, and those were great questions. I appreciate it.